Hello and welcome to the Trucking History Channel. This is a special presentation about the earliest days of the development of the trucking industry. All of the large companies we remember as fallen flags probably got their start with one man and a truck. Most of the individuals and motor carriers talked about in this video will be ones you've never heard of, but I assure you each one had a part in the development of the industry. It had to start somewhere, and by the end of this video, you'll have a better understanding about the early history of the trucking industry. Here's what I'll cover in this video. I'll talk about what certificates of authority were and the requirements to get one. I'll explain the difference of what one state did compared to what the Interstate Commerce Commission did as far as assigning certificates. We'll also discover how small some of the earlier motor carriers were and how some of those were able to grow. At the end, I'll tell you about the largest companies in the 1920s in one state. Keep in mind that this period was before motor carriers were interstate. They only operated in one state mostly. I hope you enjoy the presentation. Hours of research went into preparing this video just for you. In this video, we'll look at the very early history of the trucking industry. States began regulating motor carriers beginning in the early 1920s, long before the federal regulatory body called the Interstate Commerce Commission. Today, we'll look at the trucking industry beginnings in the state of Iowa. Why Iowa? Published records are plentiful. Not every state has put records online on the very early certificates of authority issued to the individuals that started hauling freight. In Iowa, the motor carriers were initially regulated by the Iowa Railroad Commission, and volumes of their activities are available. I've spent hours researching these volumes to bring you the history of the trucking industry in that state. In 1923, applications were beginning to be filled with the Iowa Railroad Commission to those who were already running a truck hauling freight. Most trucks of that time were small, with capacity of only 1 to 4 tons. Most roads were still unpaved, and the low maximum speeds meant having only between serving cities that were not too far apart. Generally, if one was already transporting freight on April 14, 1923, the Iowa Commission took it on good faith and granted the issuance of what was called a Certificate of Authorization. The earliest applications were granted during the summer of 1923 and into late February of 1924. A year later, these certificates of authorization were replaced with a piece of paper called Certificate of Convenience and Necessity. Why was it called that? In a moment, I'll tell you. I'll also tell you what was required to get one and the reasons one might not be issued one. Let's take a short break. I hope you will consider giving this video a thumbs up, and if you are not a subscriber yet, please consider becoming one by hitting the subscribe button. Okay, why were certificates called convenience and necessity? Railroads had dominated the hauling of freight for decades, and they certainly didn't want to lose revenues to the new trucking industry. They were afraid of really nothing. Trucks of the time could in no way haul the tonnage over long distances that railroads could. However, after the initial wave of certificates being issued to existing truckers under what was called grandfather rights, new applications were coming in. People saw dollar signs in driving a truck and hauling freight. To prevent everyone from flooding the highways between the same cities, it became necessary to provide for fair competition with limited people chasing the same freight. So, new applicants had to be able to show a need for their service. It had to be a convenience for shippers, a definite plus over existing railroad service, and a necessity over other transportation available sources. Each applicant was required to appear before a hearing to present evidence and or witnesses as to why they should be granted an operating certificate. Protesting arguments could be made, and those were usually made by the railroads. If granted, specific routes were spelled out along with any restrictions. This is an example of how precise those routes had to be, block by block. If granted, if denied, the applicant could reapply and have another hearing. Whatever the board recommended after the hearing was set in stone and could only be changed by amending the certificate by means of another application and another hearing. This is an example of how detailed routes could be in the early days. I don't know how other states handled their assignments of operating authority, but every time a carrier would be granted additional routes in Iowa, a new certificate number would be issued. For example, C.L. McLeod of Iowa Falls, Iowa, had 4 separate certificate numbers by 1930. When the Interstate Commerce Commission began issuing certificates in the 1930s, a carrier would be assigned one docket number, and when an application for authority was filed, that one number would follow that carrier while in business. Anytime an extension of routes was granted, it would be given a sub-number under that docket. For example, each time Riss and Company added another route, the next sub-number would be read and used, like MC200, Sub 1, Sub 2, Sub 3, and on up into the hundreds. In the mid-1920s, the Iowa Commission began to list all the motor carriers operating in the state. The first year, there were only 66 of them. The one with the most revenues didn't even pass $30,000 for an entire year, and that carrier was C.L. McLeod. Thank you for watching. Hopefully you'll subscribe. That's it for today, and keep watching because I have other videos in the works.